All right, this is the second lecture for topic 4 on civil liberties. Usually I do an overview about what you're going to be learning in this lecture, but this time I'm taking a little bit of a different approach. Look, there's a lot to learn about civil liberties, and this chapter is pretty long. And in fact, if you love this chapter and love civil liberties, I encourage you to take an entire semester course on civil liberties that's offered in the spring semester if you want to learn more. So I'm viewing this lecture as more of a guidepost for navigating the major themes within this relatively long chapter. And so we are going to take a look at religious freedoms, speech freedoms, the right to privacy, the right to bear arms, and the right to criminally accused. Now, there is a lot of material in your textbook for each of these subject areas. So this lecture is in no way a substitute for what you're going to be reading in the textbook with all of the different cases and the way that the court has decided these sorts of cases. Again, this lecture should be viewed as a general overview of some of the themes you'll be learning about. Before we get into the specific topics that were enumerated on the previous slide, I want you to keep these main points in mind as you're learning about all of the civil liberties and personal freedoms in this chapter. So when you think about civil liberties, you need to think about it in terms of the balancing of interests. That on the one hand, individuals have the right to live freely. But on the other hand, the state has an obligation and an interest in making sure that people are protected and that they are free from harm. And the state has an obligation to make sure that people are kept safe. So just because you have personal freedoms that are granted to you in the Bill of Rights doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want, say whatever you want, bear whatever kind of arm you want, practice any kind of religion that you want, okay? There are limits on your exercising of your personal freedoms. Freedom is not unfettered in a democracy. I want you to think back to a previous lecture where we learned about Hobbes's state of nature. And remember that Hobbes's state of nature was this place where there was no government. And there was a really good aspect of living in the state of nature. And that really positive aspect was that since there was no government control, there was no government, you could do whatever you want. You had maximum liberty. However, keep in mind that there's a clear downside to that. Living in a world where everybody can do whatever they want and be as free as they want it could be a very dangerous place. Remember, Hobbes called the state of nature that it was a place where life was nasty, brutish, and short. So unfettered liberty can lead to disorder and harm for others. And so the state has an obligation to protect the public from harm. So while a person has a right to protest, for example, that would be an individual liberty that you would be exercising, that once that protest presents a harm to others in the community, the state is well within their rights to curtail your speech freedoms and your right to assemble. And that's true for all the liberties that we're going to be learning about. That it's a balance between individual rights and the interests of the state. The thing is that it's sometimes hard to determine what presents a harm and when the state has the proper authority to limit personal freedoms in the name of ensuring order. And so that is not an easy question to answer. Sticking with the protest example, when does a protest become harmful? It's not always clear to figure out what that line is. And that's why we turn to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court there is to determine the proper balance between an individual's rights and the state's obligation to keep us safe from harm. Okay, so let's turn our sights to the First Amendment. And there's the text of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so earlier in the previous lecture, I asked you, could you name the 5 liberties that are included in the First Amendment? And there you have it below: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. you're going to notice that the first liberty in the First Amendment is not speech, it's not press, it's not assembly, it's not the right to petition a government for a redress of grievances. It is religion. And that is not unintentional. The colonies were founded in large part due to people seeking escape from religious persecution, and religion has always played a very dominant role in American political culture, even prior to the foundings. And so when the Constitution was created, it was very mindful, the framers were very mindful of the role that religion plays in the United States. And so, as we're going to see in a moment, there are two clauses that relate to religious freedoms. We'll be learning about those in a moment. But when you're learning about those clauses, I want you to keep the goals of these religious clauses in mind. Because the states that there was a lot of religious activity going on in the states, contrary to popular belief, there was also a lot of religious diversity within these early states. You had Catholicism in the state of Maryland. You had Quakers in the state of Pennsylvania. You had Episcopals, which were part of the American version of the Church of England in Virginia. And in the southern states, you had the rise of the Baptist movement. And so there was a lot of religious diversity in the states. And so one of the goals of the religious clauses, in particular the goal of the Establishment Clause, which we'll be learning about in a moment, was to reduce conflict. If you say that government can't support one religious group or give favor to one religious group over another, and that religious groups are sort of treated as being on an equal playing field, then that can reduce conflict because one religious group doesn't feel like it is sort of being not given the proper respect by the state. You sort of take the state out of it, and the hope is that it reduces conflict. The religious clauses were also mindful that there were some dominant religions in the early states, in particular the Anglican religion, but there were minor religions as well, religions that didn't have as many adherents, such as Quakerism or the early Baptists. And so the religious clauses provide protection for outgroup religions that provide for a reduction of conflict. And also that the religious clauses provide freedom to worship through the Free Exercise Clause, but it also says that you can't be forced to worship because the government can't get involved in endorsing or coercing somebody to practice religion. For the framers, they felt that your religious beliefs, your choice to worship or to not worship, was a fundamental liberty because it had to do with your freedom of conscience, what you truly believe as an individual. The consequences of the religious clauses is that the United States has always had a strong level of religious affiliation, and that continues on today. Today we have high levels of religiosity compared to other countries like us, and we also have a tremendous amount of religious pluralism. So because of the religious clauses, the states being sort of, or the government not being able to be involved in promoting religion, that basically lets people have freedom of choice to choose what religion they want to practice. And you actually saw a pretty vibrant competition between religions that were free to seek out adherents and make a case that their religion was better than other religions, which led to a lot of religious pluralism, a lot of different religions in the United States, which is obviously still alive and well today. Okay, so let's take a look at those clauses we were just talking about. The one clause is known as the Establishment Clause, and that is the clause that says Congress shall not establish a religion. And that is basically where there's a separation between church and state. The Establishment Clause says that you have freedom from the state imposing any particular religion or giving favor to one religion over another religion. The Free Exercise Clause is an individual liberty, that the government can't interfere with your practice of religion. And so it's the freedom to practice religion of choice without the state interfering. When you're reading in the chapter about the Establishment Clause cases, that the cases that come to the court are always about to what degree can the state be involved in religion. Should there be absolutely no intermingling between the government and religions, or can there be some kind of intermingling as long as that intermingling is relatively benign? Well, as you'll read in the chapter, so the question is, when we have separation of church and state, is how tall and strong is the wall between church and state? And the court has different approaches to the strength and the height of that wall, depending on the context. And so when it comes to religion in schools, and this would be public schools. And so when you have public schools that are, and where you have a state that is saying that in public schools you must pray, or that in public schools you must display the Ten Commandments outside the principal's office, that there must be a member of the clergy at a graduation ceremony, etc. You'll be reading about those cases. The Supreme Court has been very strict and says that the wall between church and state when it comes to religion in school is very tall and it's very strong. It's not porous at all. It's like a big, big brick wall. And you're going to find that in the case Lemon v. Kurtzman, that the Supreme Court actually comes up with a test that they use to determine whether or not the state influencing religion in the public schools, whether or not that's a violation of the Establishment Clause. You'll find on other matters that the Supreme Court says that the wall between church and state is much lower and much more porous. And so when it comes to religious displays in the public square, like outside of a city hall, when it comes to prayer before a town council meeting or before a session of Congress, when it comes to having "In God We Trust" on our money, on our pledge, that the courts have said that that's sort of a non-denominational expression of religion and support for religion, and that it's taking place in a venue where there are not sort of more malleable minds like children within school, and so they have allowed that. So when you're reading the textbook, you'll sort of learn about the different approaches that the Supreme Court has taken to the Establishment Clause. The other clause that you'll be learning about as it relates to religious freedoms is known as the Free Exercise Clause. And the Free Exercise Clause is about an individual practicing their religion. And so basically, the Free Exercise Clause is saying that an individual can believe and practice their religion of choice. They can also hold no religious beliefs without any consequence, okay? So you're free to practice your religion or no religion as you see fit. Now, keep in mind that the court has created what's known as the belief-action distinction. And this is where the balancing of interests comes into play. You can believe, you can hold whatever religious belief that you want to. That your belief is absolutely protected. So if you want to believe that in order to get to heaven, that you need to sacrifice 7 virgins on the top of a hill when there's a full moon out, you can believe that, okay? You can believe that's your religious belief, that doing that is how you get to heaven. You can believe that. However, you can't put that belief into action. So while your religious belief is absolutely protected, where the state can get involved in regulating your religious exercise is when you put that belief into action. And religious practice can and is restricted, particularly if the government can show that there's a compelling reason for restricting your religious practice. So in that crazy hypothetical where you're like, to get to heaven, I've got to kill virgins during a full moon. If you put that into action, you will be arrested for a homicide, and your claim that you were exercising your religion would not hold up into court. Likewise, if you're a parent who denies your child medical treatment, life-saving medical treatment, or really any kind of medical treatment, and because of your religious beliefs, you could be charged for child neglect, okay? But sometimes it's a little bit, it gets a little bit trickier than that. And so you'll read cases about where it's not completely clear whether not the court is justified in restricting your religious beliefs. A good example is the example of an army sergeant who is forbidden for wearing a religious head covering called a yarmulke if you're Jewish. They said as a member of the military, you are forbidden from wearing that. And the question was, is the government justified in regulating that kind of religious practice? Okay, this is kind of a quick overview of a bunch of civil liberties, but, again, that's just sort of the purpose of this lecture. Let's move to speech freedoms. Okay, so like all the other liberties you're going to be learning about, that there's a delicate balancing act that we try to strike when it comes to your freedom of speech. That even though the First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law abridging your freedom of speech, that phrase has never been taken literally. Congress can, as can state governments, they can regulate your speech. The question is what kind of speech garners the highest level of protection from the courts? Well, the type of speech that gets the highest level of protection from the courts is what is known as political speech. And political speech, just really, don't think about it in terms of political parties, but it's speech that is targeted at communicating ideas, social and political ideas. And so anytime your speech is trying to promote a particular idea, whether it's a certain public policy that you think should be adopted or forbidden, or a certain political party or political point of view that you think is the best or the worst or whatever, right? Anytime speech is trying to communicate a value and idea that relates to society or politics, that gets a tremendously high level of protection from the courts. In fact, you'll be learning in the case Brandenburg v. Ohio that it is nearly impossible to curtail political speech. We have a test that's known as the clear and present danger test that is used, and that basically it says that the speech can only be curtailed if it is directed to or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. So it's a really high test in terms of restricting speech. And usually speech does not rise to the level of producing imminent lawless action. Keep in mind that speech that is hateful or offensive, as long as it's communicating ideas and it's not presenting a clear and present danger, is protected by the First Amendment. And you'll be reading about that in the case Snyder v. Phelps. That's a landmark case that has to do with the Westboro Baptist Church. The Westboro Baptist Church is a really small church that recently had been protesting outside of the military funerals for fallen soldiers who had died on the battlefield. The Westboro Baptist Church believes that because the U.S. military allows gay and lesbian soldiers to openly serve in the military, that the soldiers deserve to die because homosexuality is an abomination, and God has every right to strike down those who support homosexuality. Kind of a little bit freaky and extreme, but that's what Westboro Baptist Church promotes. You'll see in Snyder v. Phelps that a father of a son who was being buried, his son was a soldier, that the Westboro Baptist Church protested outside of his funeral, and the question was whether or not that hateful speech was protected. And the Supreme Court said that yes, it was, that it didn't rise to clear and present danger levels, and they were trying to communicate an idea, even though many would find that idea as highly offensive. So we have to ask ourselves, why is there such high level of protection regarding speech in the United States? And the thinking is that speech is the cornerstone of living in a democracy. You really can't have a democracy if you don't feel like you can truly express yourself without fear of government censorship. In a democracy, we need to know all of people's viewpoints, regardless of regardless of whether we think those are good or bad viewpoints, because we need to know what the majority of people want. And probably most importantly, that you really can't determine what the truth of an idea is or the validity of the idea is unless you're able to hear it, talk about it, debate it, and make a case for why this is a good point of view or an abhorrent point of view. And that if you shut down speech, you don't have that competition within the marketplace of ideas. And so that's why the Supreme Court has carved out a lot of protection for political speech. Other speech is given a lot less protection. You'll read about that in your textbook. Speech that's only point of the speech is to bring about a fight. Speech that's only is criminal and designed to threaten or harass others. Pornography, libel, and slander, those get very limited protections from the court, if at all. And then finally, keep in mind that some kind of speech, just because it says speech, doesn't mean that it's just words that come out of your mouth. Speech can be communicated, or ideas can be communicated without using words. So like burning a flag or wearing an armband. That kind of speech is considered to be under the jurisdiction of the First Amendment, and it can get First Amendment protections. Okay, the next liberty we're going to look at is the right to privacy. Now, a lot of times students think that the right to privacy is just the Fourth Amendment, the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, and that if the cops want to come into your house, they have to have a warrant based on probable cause. The right to privacy is more than the Fourth Amendment. The right to privacy is a broader concept that means that in a democracy, individuals have the right to be left alone. And what they do in the privacy of their own home, and what they do in the privacy of relationships with others, of their close companions, what they do with their body, that those are free from government intrusion. Again, keep in mind the balancing of interests, that if what you're doing in your home is criminal and the cops have enough reason to believe that what you're doing in your home is criminal, you have every right to invade that privacy, okay? And so the right to privacy, like all of our other rights, are subject to that balancing of interests. So the right to privacy covers issues that deal with private matters. So you'll be learning in your textbook about cases dealing with whether or not the government can forbid you from using birth control, whether the government can forbid you from getting an abortion, whether or not the government can forbid you from having and engaging in certain types of sex, like same-sex activities. Same-sex marriage is included in this as well, and whether or not you have the right to suicide, to kill yourself. All of those are the broad issues that are covered under the right to privacy. And it's a very interesting part of the chapter that I think you'll enjoy reading. Now, the controversy around the right to privacy is that there is no amendment that specifies that Congress shall make no laws abridging your right to privacy. It's not specifically stated in the Constitution. Rather, the right to privacy is an implied right, okay? That the right to privacy emanates from the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. And so in the 14th Amendment, it says that states, and then we also have a 5th Amendment that applies to the federal governments. It says that the government can't take away your life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. It's that word liberty that's been used to cover the right to privacy. The way the courts have looked at this is they say that there are certain rights that are fundamental and that you can't live in a democracy without those rights. And the right to be left alone and to have control over your private life is deemed as one of those fundamental liberties that is afforded to you by our Constitution. It's a big source of controversy because there's a disagreement about whether or not the Constitution actually provides protections for the above listed matters. If you've been following the appointment of the new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, this is at front and center. She is a conservative jurist who does not believe that the right to privacy is found in the Due Process Clause. She's not necessarily against states saying that you have a right to have an abortion, or for states to say that you can get married. But she thinks that those decisions should be left to the states. But unfortunately, that liberty is not in the Constitution because it's not enumerated. So it's a big source of controversy because there's disagreement on the court as to whether or not there is actually a right to privacy within our Constitution. Key cases associated with the right to privacy are Griswold, Roe, Lawrence, and Obergefell. And so you will be reading about those in the textbook. Okay, so on to the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment. Now here's the text of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Okay, so the Second Amendment is odd. It's odd because it's the only amendment that has this preamble. And it's led to confusion about which part of the Second Amendment is most important in terms of figuring out what the meaning of the Second Amendment is. Is the phrase, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state shall not be infringed? Is that the clause that gives us the meaning of the Second Amendment? Or do we sort of set that first phrase aside and just say the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed? And so the prefatory clause, that is, that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state shall not be infringed, that's viewed as, it's known as the militia clause. And people who think that that clause gives us the meaning of the Second Amendment view the Second Amendment not as an individual right to bear arms, but a collective right. It's basically saying that states can raise militias and Congress cannot interfere with the state's right to raise a militia, because the militia is a state-based army, right? And so that meaning of militia is sort of like a group of armed individuals who are defending the state. Or is it the so-called operative clause or the right to bear arms clause that basically drives the meaning of the Second Amendment? In other words, that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed upon. Well, up until DC versus Heller, which is a key case you'll be reading about, which was decided in 2008, the Supreme Court said that the Second Amendment was a collective right, that the Second Amendment was designed to protect the state's rights to raise militias, and because that militias weren't really even used anymore, that it's kind of a meaningless amendment. That changes in 2008. Where a key case comes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that no, the Second Amendment is not a collective right, but it's an individual right, and individuals have a right to bear arms. Keep in mind again, that doesn't mean that it's an absolute right and you can bear any kind of arms, and that's clearly stated in DC versus Heller. You have an individual right to bear arms, but the state can't put regulations on that right, particularly if the state views it as important for the safety and health and well-being of the nation. All right, and last but clearly not least is the amendments that deal with due process and the rights of the criminally accused. Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments give us the essence of the due process of law. And basically what the due process of law is that there needs to be an actual stated process for a person who's accused of a crime. And so the Fifth Amendment tells us that there's a process, that you can't be forced to incriminate yourself. The Sixth says that, yeah, we're going to try you, but that the trial has to be fair, it needs to be speedy, that there are certain rights that you have during trial, the right to have a jury of your peers, etc. And the Eighth Amendment is saying that, that once you are found guilty, there's due process, that you can be sentenced, but you can't be sentenced in a way that is cruel and unusual. And then the Fourth Amendment, as we know, is the amendment that says that prior to being convicted or charged with a crime, that when they're investigating you for whether or not you've committed a crime, that there's certain rules that cops have to follow. And that is that they have to have probable cause in order to search and get a warrant, usually. These amendments outline the rights granted to those accused of committing crimes, and you will read about all the key cases associated with that in the textbook. But we'll end here by just asking ourselves why 4 of the 10 amendments are designed to protect the rights of those accused of crimes, 40%. And why is that? Well, the main reason for that is because the framers knew, and James Madison in particular, knew that the state is mighty and the individual is weak. And when the state wants to charge somebody with a crime, search somebody, convict somebody, and sentence somebody, they have all the money and all the power that they need in order to basically trample over any individual or most individuals. And so these amendments are designed to sort of level the playing field. Because the individual is weak and comes to the court, oftentimes accused of a crime where it's sort of like, accused of a crime probably did it, that we provide these constitutional protections to at least come closer to a level playing field, even though we are far from that. Okay, thanks for listening to this down and dirty sort of quick overview of the civil liberties, but hopefully it will give you the guideposts that you need to dig into the chapter more fully.